Well, can I just thank all of you at the outset for participating in what I certainly hope will be an invaluable resource for aspiring barristers and those going through the pupillage process in the coming months and years ahead. Obviously, today we are sat as the pupillage panel of Fake Street Chambers, and all of us in a moment will introduce ourselves to the last candidate that we are interviewing as part of the process. With that in mind, can I ask Roshan Neesan to enter the room, please? Roshan, hello.
Hello, good afternoon.
Thank you for joining us, Roshan. I'm just going to ask the panel firstly to introduce themselves. I'll have to name them if that's okay, and then they'll know to speak. But Francis, if I could ask you to introduce yourself.
I'm Frances Lawley. I'm a civil practitioner.
Natasha?
I am Natasha Shatunde. I'm a family practitioner.
Ruth?
Hi, I'm Ruth Reed. I'm a criminal practitioner.
James?
I'm James Pereira. I'm a civil practitioner specialising in environment and planning.
Laura?
Hi, my name's Laura. I work in both criminal and regulatory.
And last but not least, the chair of the panel and head of chambers, Paul?
Hi, Roshan. Paul Cabin at QC. I'm a criminal practitioner, mostly prosecution, but a bit of defence.
Hello all.
Excellent. Roshan, very briefly, you'll be aware Fake Street Chambers is a national set of chambers. We're a multidisciplinary set. I myself specialise in commercial litigation and international disputes. As a matter of course, we'll be taking you through this interview process. It's going to involve, as you know, two sections. The first is going to be a debate, which I'll ask you to run in a moment. And the second part will be some questions based on the CV that we've had through from you. It goes without saying, of course, that we've been very impressed with your CV and you've done very well to get to interview today. In relation to the debate, just to be clear around the format, you have 7 minutes for the debate. The first minute and the last minute are protected. That is to say that you will not be interrupted during the course of that first and last minute. You will know that that time has elapsed because I will tell you it has. In the 5 minutes in the middle, any member of the panel may interrupt you and you are obliged to respond to their intervention. At the conclusion of 7 minutes, of course you may finish before, it's a matter for you, but at the conclusion of 7 minutes, I will then move us along to the next part of the interview. Is that clear?
Yes, thank you very much.
Can you just remind the panel both of the debate topic and the side that you have chosen, please, Roshan?
Yes, so the debate topic is to argue either for or against the proposition that the imposition of a lockdown is an intolerable erosion of individual rights and is fundamentally unenforceable. I have argued for the proposition.
All right. Well, in your own time, go ahead.
Thank you. The imposition of the lockdown is an intolerable erosion of individual rights in the UK, and it is fundamentally unenforceable. To assist in this discussion, I have considered the lockdown to be the terms imposed by the UK government, and in terms of enforceability, there's two ways I've considered it. The first is the imposition of a sanction on those who breach the terms of the lockdown, and the second is the reality of whether or not the terms of lockdown can be abided by, the practical reality to say. turning to my arguments, there are 3 points that I make in support of saying that it is an intolerable erosion. And then I go on to consider the enforcement point. Turning to the erosion of rights, the imposition of a lockdown is fundamentally a manifestation of the nanny state. People, certainly before the lockdown was imposed, were informed of the risks associated with COVID-19 and were informed of not only how it can be caught, but also what damage it can do to one's body. And so, in full knowledge of that risk, people can and should go about their daily basis, go about their daily activities on their own basis, as and when or as and how they please. The second point is primarily in response to an argument that the lockdown is imposed because of the benefit to society overall, i.e. the point that there'll be greater benefit to society by imposing a lockdown than the detriment to the individual, essentially a harm principle point by J.S. Mill. In response to that, that view is essentially evidence of short-termism. It's considering that the state will benefit the most in the short term.
Roshan, can I, just on that point before you move on, sorry to interrupt you, you started off by saying that the initial advice was of course voluntary, and the lockdown is of course, as you rightly observed, legally enforceable. Isn't the problem with your argument that in fact that almost everybody's been complying with it? So given that everybody's been complying with it, the police aren't knocking on one's door every night and checking you're in. How do you say that it's an intolerable erosion on individual rights?
Paul, I appreciate the question. I think that's a point that I'll be coming to later on, if that will assist then. Thank you. Yes, as I was saying, to pick up where I left off, the imposition of a lockdown is the manifestation of short-termism. We have seen the economic impact that the lockdown currently has. We know that it's going to have a very, very long impact, a very powerful impact on the economy moving forward. Whereas if the lockdown wasn't imposed and people were allowed to go about their daily business and produce the economic output that they ordinarily produce, then the long-term effects, the long-term economic effects, will not be as severe. I think a good example to draw to is, for example, suicides become much more common during periods of great economic depression. And quite plainly, that is a very, very devastating long-term effect, not only for the person concerned, but for their families as well. We can also then think about this point as well from a job market perspective, that people have now completely lost their jobs because companies have gone bust by virtue of the lockdown. Flybe is a good example. The staff that may be made redundant for any other airline, British Airways, for example, again raises the point.
Yes, do you mind if I just ask you a question? Because we're talking here about individual rights, and it says, it's an erosion on individual rights, and you're talking about work and so on, but actually, the government hasn't said that people can't work. It's just imposed restrictions on movement. So the opportunity is still there, and it may be hard for some people, but not for others. So, and it kind of echoes the point that was asked of you earlier. Why is this intolerable, and why is it really an erosion? Because it's temporary, isn't it? So don't we have to look at what's going to happen when it all ends?
I mean, it's an erosion in the sense that, for the time being, people, as you quite rightly say, can't come and go as they please. But there are some jobs, to answer the point that you've addressed, where moving and going about your business is part and parcel. to that job. And as such, is if you can't travel, let's say you work on a plane because there have been flight restrictions imposed by the government, or outright travel bans to certain countries, well, then you simply cannot work. Not all jobs can be done remotely. And so if you impact or you curtail someone's ability to move around, well, then certainly for some jobs, you're going to frustrate the ability to do that job from the outset.
Roshan, if I can jump in there, you spent a lot of time speaking about the economic downfall that could follow, but one of the main purposes of the lockdown is obviously for the protection of lives. How can you look at the economic aspects and not consider, if people do continue to go to work and spread this virus, then we're looking at a great loss of our workforce?
Yes, I can appreciate that. The point in response to say, if we look at the number of fatalities, for example, the overwhelming evidence seems to suggest that it's those who are perhaps most vulnerable to a range of different illnesses, those with pre-existing conditions, that are most at risk. A compelling argument could be made to say that these were people that, all best will in the world, were not going to live much longer. So to touch upon the point regarding enforcement, it requires police on a local level who simply aren't there to ensure that everyone is complying with the terms of the restrictions. And it also requires the terms of lockdown to actually be possible to implement, to follow. My apologies. For example, if one goes to a shopping centre or a supermarket, it's not always possible to...
All right, Roshan, I'm going to stop you there. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
I actually gave you an extra minute there, being generous. If we can move on to the second part of the interview, which, as I said before, is a series of questions in relation to your very impressive CV. And I'll ask the panel, please, to kick off with any questions that they have.
Hi, Roshan. Can I ask you, let me ask you this. People often say barristers or advocates are a bit like actors. And like actors, we sometimes analyse and overanalyse our performances afterwards and think we wonder whether we could have done it better. Given what you've just gone through, if we asked you to do that again, can you think of anything you'd do differently?
Yes, actually, I'd say that, admittedly, I deliberately chose the side of the argument that, to my mind, was counterintuitive. And perhaps in reflection, it's not the side that I really ought to have argued. I feel that there are certainly more compelling points against the proposition, and that's perhaps the side I should have gone for, but I chose for the argument, primarily because I know sometimes you, as advocates, you find yourselves in a very difficult position trying to argue a very difficult point, which, for the best will in the world, is more likely than not going to go against you, but you still have to give it a crack. But I think I might have been able to do a better job of arguing against the proposition.
Well, that was a good answer.
Thank you.
Thank you. Roshan, I've got a question for you. I mean, I think, as has been said earlier, your CV is very impressive and well done for getting this far. But I wanted to ask you this, actually. What do you think, looking at your application, what do you think the single strongest point is in your application? but also what do you think the single weakest point is in your application, and why?
I think the single strongest point of my application is my ability to manage different priorities at the same time. From my CV, you'll see that I worked full-time whilst also studying for my bar exams, doing the course part-time. And that really honed my skills in terms of managing my time and making sure that I prioritized the right activity for whatever I needed to do that day. That's something I picked up when I used to work as a sales assistant, for a Saturday job type thing. And so it's really helped me to focus and to make sure that I get everything done to the best of my ability. And I think it's a skill that will help me tremendously moving forward, especially when I'm managing different cases, potentially even different practice areas, at both the different competing intellectual requirements that they may have, for example. And I think my worst point or my weakness is perhaps the fact that I sometimes put a great deal of pressure on myself to make sure that I do the best that I can always do. And that sometimes manifests as essentially being a perfectionist, but it means that I appreciate I can get quite frustrated when things haven't gone the way that they were supposed to have gone, and I'm trying to resolve that by essentially taking my time with what I do, with my work, etc., and then going from there.
I just interject at that stage. You said one of the things you might do to combat that is to take your time. This is obviously a highly pressurized job, and sometimes we do have to work to very strict deadlines. How are you going to cope if you don't have as much time as you would like to have? So how are you going to negate the pressure that you feel by still managing to do a good job?
I think experience is a particularly powerful teacher, and it might take me a few goes and a bit of extra time, either by working longer hours, for example, to do an activity the first time round. But once I've done it the first time round, it then becomes more like muscle memory. So by the time that I'm a bit more experienced in the game, hopefully I'll be able to get through tasks much quicker and much more efficiently than I used to do. So that should hopefully balance out some of the time pressure that I'd feel.
Thank you.
Roshan, I'd like to ask you this. I'm going to put a proposition to you and ask you whether you agree with it, and to explain one way or the other. So the proposition is, being good on your feet is much more important than your written advocacy. So do you agree, and can you explain why, please?
I agree with the proposition that being on your feet is much more important than written advocacy, and that's because as barristers, you are on your feet day in, day out, multiple times a day, undoubtedly, and so having that skill to react to something that's inevitably gone wrong, or a point that's raised that you might not have anticipated. That is an extremely powerful skill to have in any given hearing. I conduct a number of hearings in a solicitor's agent, solicitor's clerk type capacity, and I found the need to rely on the ability to respond to a point quite quickly. Whereas with written advocacy, admittedly, it's there's no guarantee that the judge reads it to start with. That's certainly from what I've found from experience. And so if there's a very little chance of it being considered in the hearing, then effectively it's a waste of one's time.
Can I interject into that? You've just said that written advocacy is a waste of one's time. However, it is quite an important and crucial skill to have as a barrister, particularly given the fact that it's the first thing that people see of you, and also something that your clients see of you as a tangible piece of work. Are you effectively suggesting that we should get rid of written advocacy altogether? Or are you saying that it's not really that important at all?
I'm certainly not advocating for getting rid of written advocacy. I understand the need for it. I mean, for example, if one considers a set of pleadings to be advocacy, well, then clearly there needs to be some written document containing a claim, a defense statement, charges, etc. But I suppose the point is that the written stuff can be amended at a later date if needed. And as I said, there's no guarantee that it's for example, if one submits a skeleton argument, there's no guarantee that the judge has considered it sufficiently far in advance of a hearing to give it proper thought. And as such, what you say in front of the judge, effectively becomes the skeleton argument that they hear or that they consider.
Thank you for that. So I'm just looking at your CV, and you appear to have a solid academic background. However, your bar course grades, you've got a competent, and it really quite lets you down. Can you help us to understand why that mark isn't an indication of your potential as an advocate?
Thank you, Ruth. I do appreciate that my mark on the BPTC is a bit of an outlier in respect to the rest of my application. And the reason for it is that I, as I said, was working full-time whilst doing the bar. And a number of my exams coincided with the end of the financial year. So in prioritizing, I unfortunately had to prioritize some modules over others. So it led to a number of the smaller modules, my electives, for example, taking a little bit of a hit. But nonetheless, it doesn't reflect my ability to become a very good barrister. And I think there's three features of my CV that I'd like to point out. And first and foremost is that my academic background, aside from my bar marks, is very, very good. I've achieved a first-class undergraduate degree, even securing a named academic prize, and my A-levels are strong. So I clearly, in my opinion, certainly, have the brains to do the job. Moving then on to my oral advocacy ability. As you can see from my CV, I already do a number of court hearings in my paralegaling capacity, but I've also mooted extensively, and I've always done really well. And in fact, in some moots, I've been particularly praised for my clarity of expression, phrasing, etc. So I can certainly talk the talk, if one were to take the pun in that. And then finally, balancing or attempting to balance the bar with a full-time job, as I said, has given me the skills I need to get through a very demanding career. And so I think I've got the tools in my belt, so to speak, to get me through. And so certainly my BPTC marks are an outlier and don't reflect my ability overall.
All right, Roshan, thank you very much for that. The panel's obviously been very impressed with your CVs because the majority of this is focused on more the competency side of things. So well done. I just wanted to check before we conclude the interview whether you had any questions for us.
Yes, I do. So as you can appreciate, I'm applying to a number of different sets for pupillage, and I've been shortlisted for one of the final rounds at a set that's not too dissimilar to yours. Their pupillage award is a bit higher. Is there anything that Chambers can do to perhaps even the scales, or is there a particular reason why your set would trump the other if I can ask it like that.
Paul, I don't know if you want to get into that.
Well, Roshan, we think carefully about our awards, and we make sure that they are, more than the minimum the Bar Council requires, and are market, to an extent, market driven. But I'm afraid we can't change those for individuals. And I suppose I should add this: a lot of sets that aren't as good as us don't get their first picks, and often try and remedy that by offering more money. So unfortunately not, is the answer to that.
Thank you, Paul.
All right, Roshan, well, thank you for attending this interview, which has been conducted in extraordinary circumstances. Thank you for your forbearance. Thank you for attending promptly, and we shall let you know in due course. Thank you very much.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.